very warm good evening to our viewers. Welcome to the Evening Review Show. Well, it's a Friday night. We're all gearing up for the weekend. But of course, serious conversations still continue on this show. I'm Matthias Ofiku, news editor of the Namibian Sun newspaper. Well, I'm joined in studio tonight by Ms. Toni Beukes. She's the head of ESG at the Hyphen. Ms. Beukes, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me, Matthias.
Thank you. Well, today is International Women's Day. Let me wish you well and all your fellow women, our mothers, sisters, everyone out there.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, that is the essence of our conversation tonight. Of course, the industry in which you operate, the renewable, the green industry, you guys are into the green hydrogen industry, a very robust industry. It's always nice to see women spearheading operations in that regard. Perhaps just tell us a bit about the work you do at Hyphen.
Thanks, Matthias. Yes, my title is Head of ESG, and at this stage of the project, which is still very early in our development of the project, I predominantly look after the social component, and so it has to do with how Namibians will benefit under the project. I think in previous engagements that we've had with stakeholders, we always talk about the socio-economic development framework that we've negotiated with government, and that looks at employment opportunity to the project, but also skills development linked to that. How do we capacitate Namibians, as many Namibians as possible, to take up opportunities of employment, and similarly on procurement, so looking at the goods, services, materials, etc., that need to be supplied to the project. We look at a localization component, how much of that would be able to be taken up by Namibians. And so my task look after the rollout of that socioeconomic development framework as we get ready to head to construction and eventual operation of the project.
Yeah. Well, of course, 8th March is of course reserved as an International Women's Day annually. What does that mean to you? And of course, how does that fit into the whole segment of ensuring that women are on par with their male counterparts, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in the sports sector, or whatever sector we might find ourselves in?
Look, I think like most commemorative days, I think it's an opportunity to pause, right? And I think for me, particularly Women's Day is pause and celebrate, but there's also an opportunity to create awareness. And if we look, the celebratory component of that is it's really, taking stock of the roles that we play, contributions that we make to the world, and I think that's worth celebrating, especially because historically that hasn't necessarily been the case. But it's also important to know, growing up in Namibia, for me personally, I've experienced very relatively low levels of discrimination as a woman, but that's always the case. I think even in the context of our country, it depends on really your cultural background, your economic standing, potentially your particular family dynamics, and so on. So we have very potentially different lived experiences around protection of gender rights, and a feeling of being seen in the world, decisions that we're able to make. And so a day like this also creates the opportunity for us to continue to have the conversations around the challenges that women face, because it is different for different women, not just around the world, but even in our own country.
Yeah. Of course, this year's theme is Inspire Inclusion. Of course, our late President, Dr. Hage Geingob, has always called on Namibians to ensure that the Namibian house is one of inclusivity. What does that mean to you? And also, you've spoken about the need to pause and reflect on this day and have conversations really that ensures that targets, perhaps such as empowerment, are achieved and so on. So this theme, how do you see this building and fitting into that narrative?
Yeah. So I think that the first recognition is it should be that we are so diverse, and not just in terms of gender, but also of other dimensions of life and society. And so when we talk about inclusion, it's really speaking from the perspective of that acknowledgement of the diversity, and how the acknowledgement that it's that diversity that brings this any aspect of life that we're speaking about. And so inclusion is how do we change or foster change our existing environments, whether that's in the workplace, to invite for greater participation, where everybody feels respected, acknowledged for the unique contribution they bring. So I think there is still a lot to do, depending on which aspect. Specifically in the workplace, I think we should really all be looking at the sort of challenging our own biases, and when we do that, it's recognizing or having a conversation how those internal biases could be reflected in some of the work that we do, whether it's in the form of a policy or a process that's designed that maybe on the face of it looks harmless, but having the deeper conversation to say it's really inclusive and people feel safe if you talk about a young person or a woman or any other diverse group. So I think that's really the role of this inspiring inclusion. That's the focus we should be putting to it.
Yeah. Of course, you've had the opportunity to study and work abroad. If you compare that to back home, how do we compare as far as women empowerment drives are concerned? Are we on par? Are we doing enough? Are we not doing enough? What should we look at? How would you sum that up?
Yeah, I think, my background is legal, and I like to look at things predominantly from that perspective, I suppose. And I think Namibia comparatively has done, if you compare it to other countries in Africa, but also globally, we've done pretty well in promoting equity and equality of women. Namibia's constitution specifically guarantees equal rights for all citizens, regardless of gender, as an example. And we've enacted legislation to promote women's rights, but also at a political level, and kind of country level, we see women occupying some roles. SWAPO's policy around the 50% requirement of women in senior leadership within the party, that's one example, right? As a result of those sorts of policies, we see a significant number of women participating in parliament, compared to very many other African countries. But I think it's important to, like I said, celebrate those achievements and where we have done, but also recognize that those don't necessarily through to every female citizen of this country. And I think that's where the work is required. So how do we ensure that those policies apply everywhere? So I think if I look at where I've worked, and where I've been in other countries, I think Namibia has done really, really well. Yeah.
Yeah. There exists this perception, especially in the political circle, where parties such as the ruling Swapo party that you've mentioned have adopted gender policies to ensure 50-50 representation. And I'm sure this can go across the board, whereby some people feel this is more of a tokenism gesture, compared as to where women really claw their way up. Do you think this is a fair outlook on these efforts to ensure 50-50 gender representation across the board?
No, I definitely don't think so. I think if the policy is not applied properly, it can result in tokenism. I think policies are required to, because you're effectively trying to rebalance a historicity, right? If women didn't enjoy, or any other group for that matter didn't enjoy certain rights just than others, then I think we need positive and active interventions to make sure that that is enabled. And if we, for instance, look at employment equity, the employment equity legislation that we have, it tries to do exactly that. But if it's not implemented properly, it can have the unintended consequence of treating women like tokens. I like to think, I've worked and lived in South Africa for quite a while, and here around Black economic empowerment, you say, well, you know what, you're in that woman because you're either Black, or you're in that role because you're a woman. And I still say yes to both. I'm in this because I'm Black, as defined under the South African legislation, as an example, and I'm a woman, but that's not all there is to me.
Yeah.
And so I think women should embrace the opportunities that are presented for participation, and demonstrate through the competency that and the skills and the capacities and the unitions that we can make to whether it's in corporate or other tables, that's ultimately why we're there.
Yeah. Do you think there's this inherent expectation from women to sort of prove themselves more compared to their male counterparts?
I think it's normal for women to feel that way. I think in history you would understand why that is the case, because we're dealing with potentially internal biases, right? If you have, as they would say, a seat at the table in a boardroom setup, there's you kind of have to prove why you're there, and your prior background, these ideas around tokenism, or you got there because of your race or because of your gender. People sit with internal biases, and that's why there is this almost higher threshold to prove oneself. So women feel that, and it may not always be true in every circumstance, right? And so we also need to check ourselves as women to not go in with this baggage and always feeling like we are the under. In my experience, when we show up with competency and we demonstrate what we can do, and it's not this I am a woman at the forefront, but really I'm a professional, and I'm able to provide capacity, provide expertise and skills in Z fields.
Yeah.
Then in my experience, it's the uptake or being able to work with others has been easier.
Yeah. We've of course also seen over the years especially most of these global income reports still show that there's a disparity between income between men and women, even though in some cases they are doing the same work. Why do you think we're still struggling to turn that corner?
Well, I think it's a result of historically how the system has been established, and it's the task of leadership, because it's also obviously a difference between the understanding and devising programs that look at the inclusion of women, as we spoke about earlier, and how to set that up in the workplace. But really, there's also fundamentally sometimes just a shift required in how we, right, the equity component that needs to be brought into how men and women are treated in the workplace. It really requires a shift in the perceptions. Sorry, can you ask me that question again?
Yeah, it was mainly around the reports over the years that shows that women still continue to earn less than men, even in areas where they are doing the same type of work or same amount of work where output is concerned. So we have seen that those reports still indicates that there's that disparity.
Yeah, and I
Yeah, so,
think Matthias, that's just, yeah,
so it was really just on that, just to
that's for
say
me.
what should we still do to turn that corner to ensure that that equality is attained.
Yeah, I think it comes down to organizations not just paying lip service to the idea of inclusion, right? The interventions that we take should filter through as an organization, whether it's a new where we talk about and have days around inclusion, diversity. It's really a challenge to organizations and boards and leaders in those positions to say, well, are we giving effect to the ideas of equity in the workplace in all, including salaries and remuneration and how women are treated. So I think definitely a way to go, but it requires will to ensure that that happens. I haven't seen any statistics in Namibia as an example of what maybe it looks like in our country, but I know internationally that's certainly the case. So, and it requires people in positions like whether it's HR, but also women know that that is that's kept on the table, and there is greater transparency around how remuneration is determined.
Yeah. Of course, from a, just as we head towards the end, of course, from a professional level, we sort of are making that progress. But would you say at the cultural level and at the household level, as far as inspiring inclusion is concerned, which is the theme of this year's International Women's Day, are we also making similar strides in that regard?
Difficult one, Matthias. I think we come from such a diverse country, and in early on I mentioned that because of my particular background and family dynamic, and the particular set of parents that I have, my experience is very, very different. Our cultural diversity then speaks to how these sort of topics are dealt with at different levels, and it's not always the same. I think we've seen some challenges, really, but I'm a believer in things must be understood in their historical context, and I think um, culture is significant topic, and we need to allow that cultural evolution to happen. We cannot superimpose certain ideas onto a particular culture. Of course, we respect our constitution and those basic rights that are protected and enshrined for all of us around equity and protection. Those should be enforced. Our cultural our culture should be allowed to evolve naturally.
Yeah. Of course, there's also been a lot of attention paid to empowering the girl child from a young age, especially at school level and so on. But there's those that have felt perhaps, are we perhaps paying too much attention to the girl child and sort of leaving out the boy child? Because I mean, in going forward, they have to coexist in the same society. So you would want to see a situation where there's a balance. What do you think of that approach?
Um, I think it's necessary that, again, if we find ourselves in a particular sense, you know, we can't, unfortunately, I think, paint all girls in Namibia kind of with the same brush, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? We have to be very specific about the types of interventions at different levels and with different groups of people. And maybe in one circumstance, focus on a girl child in a particular setting, may be more necessary and appropriate than in another setting. So I think there is a place. So my personal view is there is a place for kind of our traditional gender roles that we've been assigned. I think there's a beauty in how men and women can coexist, and observing and respecting those gender and render roles. But they can't be enforced, right? And so I certainly don't think that we should pay less attention to boys growing up. I think that's also not the intention necessarily. It's not that the girls must enjoy greater priority. I think it's about having programs, interventions that specifically target the empowerment of girls, how they see themselves, the roles that they play and their place in the world, as opposed to necessarily being intended to undermine the role of men. So I think, but targeted interventions may be required depending on the group that you are speaking to.
Yeah. As head of ESG, of course, you deal a lot with, you interact a lot with the public. Of course, the rural and the urban setups, as far as the girl child is concerned, what are some of the interventions that you think we should be looking at to really bridge that gap between these two groups?
Well, if I look at it from the project's perspective, we are dealing with enormously complicated pieces of technology, right? So it's a very technology-driven sector. And predominantly, you look at STEM subjects, if we talk about people entering the field. So it's science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and we know that historically girls, there isn't a great uptake of those subjects, for instance, and you see more boys participating in those. So I think part of the interventions that eventually we'll be looking at supporting government with are around how do we encourage greater uptake of those sorts of subjects among young girls. So because ultimately, if we look at parity or greater participation in the sector, that's really where we need to start. So it's not an intervention that Hyphen will necessarily prioritize, because initially our priority is around how many Namibians we can get ready through training and educational programs to take up opportunities under construction phase and operational phase. But we do see our role also as supporting government to develop the broader ecosystem to allow for the growth of the sector. And so in that regard, we certainly think that I certainly think that there's a way that we could look at even just producing material and encouraging, explaining to young girls where the opportunities lie in a sector like this, which is driven by so much kind of technological advances, and making that information accessible to young people generally. But I think we have a role to play in encouraging women to, at that early age, to see what the opportunities are and encourage their participation.
Yeah. Just lastly, perhaps your parting message to your fellow women who finds themselves in a position of power, as to what your role would be. Of course, the struggle for empowerment is still not attained. So, what do you think is the role of women who currently find themselves in a position where they can affect the necessary change?
Yeah, I think when we show up in our power, so to speak, we challenge stereotypes and we challenge the bias that are out there. And so my message would be, let's continue to do that. Let's continue to show up competently and do fulfill these roles, because just the mere fact that we are there challenges stereotypes, and it challenges people's entices. And then I think there's an opportunity for us to grow in supporting each other. There isn't, I think, enough of that then where we find ourselves in environments where there are people, I think it's also developing that supportive network, and opening doors for others. Whether it's through mentorship, whether it's through in introducing younger professionals to others within your network and so on, that really helps to build confidence and yeah, I think those are the some of the important things that I can think of.
Yeah. Well, Toni, thank you very much for your time this evening. We really appreciate having you in studio. Thank you very much, and we wish you a pleasant weekend and work week ahead.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's indeed a pleasure. Well, from the evening review team, that's it from us this week. Have a pleasant evening and see you again on Monday, same time, same place.